I guess what I'd say is generally the market has started to orient around similar pricing. There's very few like Tiffany, jewelry company style pricing like organizations. There's certain products, I guess you could find outliers with anything. And some of it is like, oh, because you want a custom WordPress website and it's got the Tiffany box kind of thing to it. But then as far as the actual services of lead generation, you don't really have any of the Tiffany things happening.
It's not just the number of keywords, but yeah, how many times did you touch the account? How many optimizations did you actually make? And then just looking at that snapshot of keywords, it's like these were the 200 I started with, or these were the 3,500. I'm going to look 3 months later and see if that looks like the same picture or if it's changed. And if it hasn't changed, then that tells you something about how much attention they're putting on it.
Welcome to Digible Dudes podcast. I'm David.
I haven't heard you stumble through that in a while.
Yeah,
I'm Reid.
we're off cycle.
Yeah,
So
we are off cycle.
yeah, I got to get a few people need to start asking me about what company do you work for so I can know how to pronounce the name correctly.
Yeah,
I need good like
yeah,
frequency.
yeah, totally.
Well, today's podcast, Reid, we decided we wanted to talk about what is a digital commodity. What things in our industry do we view as commodities? And I don't know if we're more guilty of this than perhaps our clients or listeners, but there's certain things for sure, and I'll use an easy one where basic call tracking has felt like it's a commodity in the space. No matter if you're a digital agency, you're like, yep, I can get call tracking. Yep, it should be included. Maybe you upcharge for it, but anyways, it's just basically it's the same thing. So we thought this would be a good topic to dive into and say what today feels like a commodity if you're an apartment marketer, and then how do we view it on the vendor side as far as like is it truly a commodity? Where may it differ? And is there anything you should be aware of? So that's the
Yeah.
topic.
Yeah, and it I think, I appreciate you saying maybe somewhere you were pointing to our perspective, versus perhaps the industry's perspective. And when I say that, I'm talking mostly about our core client, which are the multifamily marketers, because, it's already occurred to me, I'm just gonna use a quick example of geo-fencing. You and I would probably immediately say, "Yes, that's a commodity." But uh, not necessarily how it's being interpreted by the multifamily marketer. Many of them, I still think, think there is uniqueness to that. It's still kind of bleeding edge, new technology, and so just a good example of something for us years ago, we probably would have identified that as a commodity. So before we get too much further, and I told you I would do this to you, I'm going to ask you to define commodity, and then I'm going to actually read to you the definition from Merriam-Webster. And there's an interesting, I'll just say, stealing my own thunder here, a little bit of a contradiction.
Yeah. Well, first of all, since people have been getting amused when they get shouted out on the podcast, somewhere in the wild, John Silverman has lost his wings because you called geofencing a commodity. They just like broke
Yeah.
off, and the poor guy's stuck.
Well, he
Can't
was
fly
always
anywhere.
correcting me. It's location-based marketing.
Uh,
It's not geofencing,
yeah,
Reid. I was like, oh,
yeah.
right.
We'll have John on here at some point, but he's the one that
He's
really got Reid and
fantastic.
I into location-based marketing.
Yes.
He's he's a star. Okay, so commodity. I view it as something that is ubiquitous, and uh, I know this isn't a Merriam-Webster description, but I just view it as something that is ubiquitous and effectively has been driven to low cost and is essentially the same no matter the provider.
That is remarkably accurate.
Oh, shoot. Did my
So
economics degree actually pay off on
I think it did. I'm very impressed. I'll say that lines up more with their 1C. So there's like 4 or 5 different definitions for commodity, but the very macro is an economic good, such as a product of agriculture or mining. When I skip down to C, it says a mass produced, unspecialized product, which is essentially what you just said. Something that, you can produce at scale, but there isn't anything overly unique about it. And you added, that can drive down costs. I think that's fair to associate when you talk about mass produce unspecialized products. But in definition two, where it's an interesting little bit of a contradiction here, it says definition is something useful or valued. So I just think there's a little bit of conflict there, where it's like it's mass produced and it's unspecialized, but it's something useful or valued. And I know you can have the two, but that's part of what will probably help springboard us into this conversation, in a way of like what's really useful and valued, but also mass produced and unspecialized.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example of something that is it'd be like because they're saying useful and valued, it'd be like air. Like, it's the whole, like, selling snow to an Eskimo kinda thing,
I think
you know?
orange juice.
Yeah, yeah, well, or pork belly futures.
I love that you got that. I love that you got that.
There you go.
That was Trading Places, folks, in case anybody hasn't seen that movie or didn't grow up in the '80s. Um, yeah, pork belly's gold.
Yeah,
The orange juice when he's explaining that to Eddie Murphy is priceless. So yeah,
yeah.
somebody go watch that. All right, well, let's jump into it now that we have the definition as David put it and as Merriam-Webster has. And yeah, let's give me a couple of examples of what you see as digital commodities right now.
So I think I want to also slightly unpack one thing you mentioned
Oh,
because
okay.
we'll need to delineate between what does an agency see as a commodity versus how does the apartment marketer experience it? Like what do they see as a
Right,
commodity?
right.
And I'll give what my example is your location based marketing or geofencing. We on the agency side may see that as a commodity, but it's the way we package it and price it to the apartment marketer where it can be differentiated, no longer feel like a commodity. Would you think
100%.
that's fair?
Yep, we dress it up, we change it from, its base commodity state into something that I don't wanna say is seen, I'd like to think is
Mhm.
more of a differentiator, that's built on that commodity.
Mhm.
Yep,
Because it's the and let's actually jump to paid search. Paid search could very easily be seen as a commodity because you can just buy I mean, it's only one provider, so it's not multiple providers, but you're just buying Google, but it's how it gets packaged and serviced by the agency that makes it specialized. Because we have
mhm,
folks all the time come to us every day saying, "Oh, we wanna use your paid search because we have these gripes about ours." That's more of a packaging, servicing issue to me and why it doesn't feel like a commodity to them.
yep, couldn't agree more.
So, things that the agency see as commodity would be like mostly like we've kind of been hinting at, which would be like anything that's a channel that is that anybody can buy, like paid social through Facebook or Instagram, paid Google, location-based marketing. I'd also put in there call tracking for basic call tracking is a commodity. Um, Obviously, I was gonna say analytics, like Google Analytics, but that's free, so it's hard to but I'll just say that it is still, I'd see it as a commodity.
I would not, because that is one of my lines, is it
You have
needs
to
to
pay
be
for it.
transactional, yeah,
Well, why I do that is because if you look at there are other vendors in the analytics space, but nobody even though they're better than Google Analytics, people are not now willing to pay for it. However, if you said you weren't allowed to use Google Analytics on a website, people would be like, "What the hell?" Because they value it so much.
yep,
So I'm just saying the leap for them because it's the whole 0 to 1. Like analytics is good enough for free, but it for most apartment websites, they don't need to upgrade to like an Adobe Analytics. Maybe
right,
if you're like Graystar.com or something, you would want to do that, but not for the most marketers. So that's what I'm saying. It's mostly a commodity, but you know.
I understand. Yep,
Um, and then I'm trying to think. Yeah, I hit search social, I hit location based. I would say bidding algorithms, pacing algorithms. Those are things where almost if you're using a platform to do your, Google pacing or Facebook pacing, most people at this point see those pacing algorithms as effectively commodities. It's really hard to differentiate yourself if you're a platform and you're saying our, bidding is better than your bidding. Yes, there are differences, but it's just based on use case. So that's on the agency side.
well, I love that you wrapped that one in. I wouldn't have gone there, but I do agree with you, and I think the way to kind of validate that idea of algorithms turning into commodities is our own education, and a lot of that's been obviously with our own tech teams, but certainly stuff we read is there are just shelves and shelves, libraries and libraries of algorithms that you can plug and play with, and more are open source. So that's part of what turns it into commodity. Is if it's behind a wall garden and very few people have access to it, then I think it's fair to say that hasn't transitioned into a full-on commodity. But in the case of algorithms, you can lift so much from a lot of the giants, as well as just the guy in the garage that is now contributing and uploading right to the cloud, and saying, "Hey, try this one for your pacing," etc. Um, I think what we also backing up to trading places, but not all these commodities obviously are priced at the same amount, and that's also maybe worth commenting on or educating our listeners about when it comes to these different platforms and algorithms, because there's different cost models and then again, just different values that are assigned to search inventory versus, Facebook inventory versus display inventory versus email, lists, etc. And that's all the things that agencies are navigating as they're trying to figure out what does that go to market look like, how much does this commodity cost, how scalable is it, and how much can I, uh, I guess, enhance it, in a way that will create more of a differentiator. But I think the most value I'll say in this discussion, for our marketers is understanding a little bit more than they perhaps do today or have, what those commodities really are or look like, the cost of them, and then being able to, I don't want to say call BS, but know whether somebody's just putting lipstick on a pig or if there's real differentiators, that have been built on top of or around those commodities. And that's where we've been critical from day one coming into this industry because we felt, frankly, like there was a lot of that going on where it's like they're just calling it this or they're doing that, but really it is just this, I'll call it commodity, and so, be aware of that. Um, and then we tried to obviously start to forge a new path, if you will. And we're not the only ones, but where we are really creating some, unique benefits, features, enhancements behind this kind of stuff. Algorithms included, maybe that'll tee you up. It seems like you're about to go somewhere else, but so much of it is what kind of data are you using to create enhancements, which data itself is one of the biggest commodities, but to make it, a real differentiator.
Yeah, our new head of product, Alex, has me reading Monetizing Innovation. And I think that book does a great job of giving examples where you could be a website provider company, and they give an example like a GoDaddy. And when you go to market, you show 35 features on the board, and then your prospective customer comes, and they basically it gets so complex their eyes glaze over, and they're like, and then that same company can whittle down those 35 features, triple the price, and they show like 4 features, triple the price, and then it sells like hotcakes. And it's because it's just packaged in a
Hmm.
more simple way to understand. It doesn't feel like, shoot, this is a big lift for me to adopt your service. So I think that's where in the early days, Digible really excelled, where we would take, a local, location-based advertising platform, and we would say, okay, let's get rid of all these bells and whistles, and let's now package it up and message it in a way that a marketer can say, "Hey, that's the easy button. You understand my industry, and I can just like set it to go because there's a lot of general settings and things you need to just have baked into it." Um, so that's where we excelled in the early days. And as you said, I think more providers they're having to get more sophisticated with it, meaning with their packaging and pricing, because it used to be I'm the only one that you've ever heard about geofencing from. So look at this slew of stuff. And then you're like, sounds cool enough. Let me buy it. Now you've heard about geofencing from 10 different people. And you're like, okay, now which of these folks does the packaging pricing feel like it lines up well enough that I'm just going to jump on them? But they're mostly using the same backbone.
Hmm.
So, anyways, most folks in this industry are using Simplify, for example, for their location based marketing. Now, Simplify is a very actually complex platform. Right. So
Ironically.
yeah, yeah. So it's more about how you then stitch it together and make it the easy button for your customer so it just works for apartments out of the gate. Because we
Y-
also know that, right? Like a campaign is not all equal because of what switches have been flipped on or not.
Yeah, totally. Well, I appreciate your comment about kind of the selling through. Like it starts with us, like as you said, packaging and messaging and making that commodity, I guess sought after, and then that has to be transferred from the market to the operator. It's like this is why location based marketing makes sense, and then ultimately they buy it or they don't, and that's what helps sets the price because that's the other question that comes up a lot when you talk about digital advertising and the commodity side of it. How does that pricing work?
Hmm.
And in some cases, I'll say most, it's auction based, but there's other scenarios where, you do just work out flat fees like based on volumes and things like that. And then you go from there. Google's most known, obviously, for an auction based environment, and it's been terrific for them. So it's fascinating sometimes to see some of the bigger tech companies or piping, a lot of the programmatic providers you mentioned simplify on how they go to market.
Hmm.
Are they going auction based and just letting it completely be dictated by demand? Or are they saying, our inventory is higher quality, which you'll see with, for example, private marketplaces, where it's like, I used to do this when I was at the Denver Post. It's like, you're never going to get that inventory for less than 350 or something. And and so it wasn't auction based or based on demand. I just said, this is my minimum. So I think that's also hopefully somewhat educational, for our marketers. I'm curious, as you think about, back to like a little bit where we started. What are the commodities? You gave me a couple of examples, and you go a little bit further that you see right now. I think we talked about listing management. We talked about Google Posts, which is near and dear to our heart. We put a lot of focus there. As you kind of deconstruct the digital landscape, because this would have to go beyond just paid, right? And you mentioned algorithms. When you think SEO, when you think organic social, where are the lines? Maybe is another way of putting it for you. But can you give us a few more examples of what you see right now as commodities and digital and multifamily marketing? And where do you start to say that's really no longer a commodity?
Let's focus it on, I had given agency commodities, then it's like, what does the marketer probably see as a commodity? Now, our
Yeah.
audience may be screaming at their radio or something when they listen to this. But my thought is there are the basic property management system websites. And if you're on those free websites are, I view as a commodity. Now, some people will then say, oh, I want to buy Jonah instead because of how it's packaged and blah, blah, blah. Right. So it's a little bit different, but it's better than the free commodity. I'd also say for the most part in this space, the lead source call tracking is a commodity. So it's like, oh, my property management system or my CRM comes with call tracking. And so that most of them are not willing out of the gate to buy, an upgraded version. Now there are folks that have been successful like Anyone Home because they were starting to do like, oh, well, we'll bundle it, we'll package it with an answering service so that you never miss another call again. So that again is just how it's
Hmm.
bundled and priced together. Um, I mean,
SEO. I'm gonna put you on the spot now with that one. Would you see that as a commodity, or do you think you have to unpack that? Right.
depends on the provider. So again, I would say the property management SEO packages are commodities, but there are definitely agencies out there that are doing non-commodity work. But my little dig at most of the property management systems are like set and forget. They're not really working on it unless you're telling them to. So yeah, but for the outside of those big providers that have tacked it on to try to grab revenue, I don't think the agencies have yet commoditized because each of the packages are very different. If you look at like us versus W Promote versus Apartment SEO, it's like they're very different packages. They have a
Hmm.
lot of the same. They say a lot of the same things, but how they're actually executed is different.
And how do you feel? And you've heard my position on this, but I'm happy to reiterate on our podcast here if needed. Um, how do you feel about the pricing right now with these commodities? And again, just to reiterate, digital advertising is mostly what I'm speaking about with multifamily. Do you think that these are being overpriced, overpaid for? Do you think that they're where they need to be, should be? Do you expect much change as you kind of look at the general model? Right, there's a lot of commodities that you were just starting to list, and then comes the dress up, the massaging, the messaging, the marketing. Adding. How do you feel right now about the pricing of these digital commodities? And
Well,
I'm saying specifically for multifamily, not for automotive, healthcare.
I think that'll take us quickly to search. So, for example, most of the folks in this space are kind of similar-ish on their fee structure for paid search. So it's like on the, as you were saying, person in their garage that you may get down the 15% management fee, and then on the upper end, if you're working with a larger organization, they may be charging you 30% sticker until you get to some sort of volume. But generally, I mean, even though it sounds like doubling of fees, there's a lot maybe that's included in the 30% management fee that the 15% management fee doesn't include. But I guess what I'd say is generally the market has started to orient around similar pricing. There's very few like Tiffany jewelry company style pricing like organizations. There's certain products, I guess you could find outliers with anything. And some of it is like, oh, because you want a custom WordPress website and it's got the Tiffany box kind of thing to it. But then as far as the actual services of lead generation, you don't really have any of the Tiffany things happening.
Hashtag 7 powers.
Yeah, so I was gonna go there. I was gonna ask you because I think process power applies into this with commodity and how it gets packaged. But um,
Toyota.
to your to the thing about paid search, do you view it as a commodity or not when it comes to the from the marketer's point of view?
I think, well, hard for me to speak on their behalf, but I do think they're now seeing it that way, for better or worse. I mean, I'd mostly agree, that search is one of the better examples of digital advertising as a commodity. But one thing I have come to appreciate, and a lot of it has been, since we kind of built this company, is that separation, that happens with some agencies and some it does not, and what they've turn it into and the enhancements and extra value that's provided. So that would be my footnote or asterisk is yes, I think they see it as a commodity. We see it as a commodity. But there's more than maybe some people understand or realize even today that can and in my opinion should be done to improve and enhance these campaigns. Google's gone so far with their own automation, and it was an interesting conversation we had. I think it's okay to say, with Sky, who was originally Kenshu, and they were a bid budget management system, and for years and years their model was built on providing you better enhancements and optimization. So they would add to that, and they had huge companies using them mainly on the e-commerce side. But eventually, they felt like Google's own native platform was closing the gap enough or passing them by, and it just was no longer a viable business model. And so they shifted to more working with and beside other, automations and agencies and stuff, and became more of a complementary solution instead of kind of this is the platform to use. And so that's just a good example of a big company that really built their business on that commodity and had to shift their business model as those enhancements became more and more native, we'll say, if that makes sense. Um, and so for us, you and I have talked. I like doing the T-shirt thing, but this comes up when you talk in terms of commodities and pricing, where it's like, how can you guys possibly be charging another 20% on top of Google, or how can you be 5xing that CPM or things like that? And you could say and would probably the same thing if you walked into a clothing retailer and were like, that shirt was made for $1.50 and you're charging $30, but you completely lose sight of all that happens, you know, for that to get to that store. And that's, I mean, maybe a bit of a stretch here, but there's a lot that goes on after, we buy the inventory, we'll say, from Google before it's actually turned into a campaign. I feel like I'm talking in terms now of like, I'm thinking Spielberg, like Dino DNA, like,
Well, I've got maybe an example that will strike with you, but when I first got in, well, not when I first started getting more serious about ultra running, I it was getting so expensive to buy the calorie drinks that
mhm,
the sports
mhm.
drinks that they want you to have. So I was like, it's basically maltodextrin. Why don't I just go buy a barrel of maltodextrin? So I bought and had shipped. I was working at Verizon, Reid. You'll love
Mhm,
this,
mhm.
and I bought I believe it was a 55-pound sack of maltodextrin, and normally
Oh my
you would
god.
then so I bought that sack for, like, $100 shipped. It showed up at our Verizon office on a pallet, and they dropped it off in at the front desk, and I was like, good thing the office is kinda empty today.
Yeah,
People are gonna be like,
right.
"What the hell?" So, I then had to take that and break it into, like, little bags, and then if I wanted flavoring, I had to add lemon, and it's like, "Oh, also I want my electrolytes in there, so now I gotta add salt." So I was mixing the recipe, but generally speaking, I bought, it would have been worth, like, $5,000 of sports drink that I bought for, like, basically 100 bucks.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah,
Yep.
and so that's what's happening, like, when you talk to a provider, you go to like Ogilvy and you're like, "Hey, I'm Lincoln, and Ogilvy run my search campaign." They're like, "Not interested. I don't want to run for a $1,500 single apartment website. Now, if
Mhm.
you're talking about like Lincoln.com or
Mhm.
whatever their
Mhm.
main
Mhm.
site is, like maybe I'll talk to you because now it's one big budget and I don't have to break it into small baggies and stuff,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So, or add the limit. Now that they may not have the limit or electrolytes to add. So that's your point about the data from where we're integrated to Yardi or RealPage or what have you, and can pull in the apartment data. So now
Mhm.
we can add some lemon flavor or something that Ogilvy couldn't have until they get to that point. So a lot of these things are commodities, and then they're industries that get disrupted, as we've seen time and time again in tech, because companies get complacent and they stop trying to bring new flavors, to
Right.
add to the drink
Right.
mix.
Right. 100%. Well, quickly coming back to the pricing, I don't mind. I'm gonna guess you don't either. Sharing some good examples here, but uh, where I mentioned the post and some of that inventory, like the display banners, you can get those as cheap as like 10 cents, 1,000, and you can also see those go for as much as $10 to $15, like direct, like from a publisher. And so, what creates such a huge gap in some of these digital commodities or advertising where in one case it's getting $15 1,000 or being bought for that, in another case it's just 10 cents. And so I've always said the market does determine it, ultimately, whether it's auction based or whether it's being bought direct or through third parties. It's ultimately what that inventory goes for, because the people that are selling it, it's perishable. It's just like going into the grocery store. Your fruit, is going to go rotten. So if you don't sell it, then it doesn't get monetized. And so ultimately it works itself out. And that's why I'm comfortable with where we're at with multifamily, the different cost models, the pricing, is because they've set that as much as the agencies or the people that are manufacturing those commodities. It's the reality. And but some do it better than others, because there is plenty of fruit that does go to waste, I'll say, if people aren't pricing it right. But generally speaking, I think that we're in a pretty healthy spot. Not everybody would say that. Certainly healthcare, automotive would have very different feelings if they came into the industry. But again, the industry sets the price as much as the agency or the manufacturer.
Yeah, when you say set the price, you mean because if you can set the price at $100, but if nobody buys it, then
Exactly.
yeah. What do you think about ILSs?
Well, that's a phenomenal example. Uh, Totally commodity to me.
Okay.
Like, maybe as good example as Google. It's like these are just directories. I'm sorry, not to hurt anyone's feelings at Jeff Goldblum and company, but uh, what they've done to increase the price and value of the commodity is they've poured in, or haven't, a tremendous amount of effort and money into Google, so that they can, have the most value, the most relevance, right? But at the end of the day, it's a listing that's searched on the internet, searchable on Google. What's unique about that?
Well, although some people would listening are probably like, well, but my leads from this ILS are not nearly as good as the leads from that ILS, and I think that's maybe where they would see the difference in it being a commodity. So but also I was thinking about it obviously because when you were saying eyeballs, it's like a lost impression. Now, the beauty of the ILSs is that they don't price on impression, which is also something we've been critical of before. But as it stands, if their traffic goes down, they don't immediately lose revenue because they're signing these properties up for annual
Totally.
contracts.
Yeah, it's not performance based. And yeah, we have been critical and fantasized a few times about if we ever built an ILS, we would probably go more performance slash auction based. But it's a great point. And when you have those longer contracts, you can do those types of things. But at the end of the day, again, to me, these are just listings that are showing up on a variety of directories. And the you did mention fair point about the quality. I think that's a smart thing. Back to like, what can you do to transform something from a commodity to something that's truly more unique or has more value? And that's a good example of that, where it's like, I'm going to gate it, and it's going to be much harder actually for them to get to this listing on this site, and that's going to make ensure that it's higher quality. Of course, we've seen that doesn't always work out. That's a different topic, for your apartment list that puts you through 80 questions and they still struggle with quality. So it's no guarantee.
But it does hit your point about what the market will bear because we've seen the ILS has raised rate 10, 20% every year
And they keep
since,
buying it.
and they keep, yeah. So the market will obviously bear more than
That's right.
what they're getting.
Don't fault, yeah, apartments.com.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody does, and everybody's frustrated by it, but as long as you keep buying it, why would
Yeah.
they stop? And that's where often alternative solutions, right? And everybody's looking for that. New methods of getting to these prospective renters are such huge points of interest right now in the industry. That's like, how can we be more prescriptive? How can we be more efficient? How can we stop being held hostage? But as long as you know that value outweighs those other options, you unfortunately probably going to need to expect more of the same.
So
Which isn't it the same for commodities outside of digital? Like back to when we're thinking about orange juice and pork bellies. It's like as long as people are willing to eat them and pay a certain price for them, that's it's up to them how much they can stretch or will stretch. The pricing.
yeah. Well, adding some value back for the marketer before we wrap up here, what are some things? Let's spend a minute discussing what are some things you often would say sizzle versus substance. So, what are some things that the marketer should be questioning? Is that sizzle or substance when they're buying from their vendors? That way, they can help to delineate, like, okay, no, that actually doesn't add that much more value. That is part of a commodity. You're just dressing up differently.
Well, you know, I'm gonna go John Silverman on location based marketing.
He got his wings back.
He got his wings back, but they might be falling off again here shortly. But he was so effective in selling the sizzle, that I think I was guilty myself when we first intersected that I wasn't looking under the hood as much as I probably should have because I was like, I'm going to be able to crush this. Like, our sales team's going to go to market with this and be wildly successful because he talked just about how precise the targeting could be and that you could get somebody in this, I'm going to use multifamily, but in this unit, send this message to them. And then just down the hallway, we would use our technology and serve them a different message because it's just a different persona to target market or whatever. And it's not that there wasn't any truth to that. And I remember that I think the business, didn't they get called ground truth?
Yeah.
um, but come to find out, that form of targeting, and I'll say precision was fairly common. There was real limitations to it, as far as what was viable, what wasn't. Part of it was also based on the amount of inventory that was actually available. But not to get too weedsy, I think that was and still is probably a really good example when you hear about geofencing or location based marketing. And somebody says, "Yeah, our targeting is super superior. It can do this, 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 and this." Um, I think that's one of those examples of, hey, that probably is a little bit misrepresented or exaggerated, and isn't that different than if you went to vendor B and said, "Hey, can I buy geofencing? How does it work for you guys?" I think just be careful, like, of being, you know,
I
too
think
swept up in the sales pitch.
I think there's also a difference there between yes, it can, but we don't. Right? Like the technology can support this, but the labor is so intensive to do the like different sequential messaging down the hall that it doesn't happen. So that's the service layered on top. So
Mhm,
to your point, you could ask vendor A, vendor B, what platform do you use? Because it's not going to be homegrown. And then if they both say simplify, be like, great, could you tell me how you actually set up the campaign? It's
mhm,
similar to asking someone in Google Ads, how many ad groups, how many keywords, how many, ads.
mhm.
And if you just get a few of those basics, you can start to get, oh, this vendor uses 200 keywords by default, and this one uses 3,500. 3,500 seems way more thought out, so I'm going to go with them. So that's how I would try to like, I guess, unpack. Is it sizzle or substance?
Yeah, no, and I was gonna go to search next, and you kinda stole my example with the keywords, but I've also said, like, you can see those logs and I appreciate when we get challenged there. I just think it makes us better because we never wanna be that, I'll say, charlatan, that, is misrepresenting what kind of work we're actually doing because we're also very focused on scale. So, it is a balance that a lot of these digital agencies or digital providers have to strike where it's like, we we want to create differentiators, but they also have to scale. And so anytime labor gets into that equation, it can make it pretty challenging. And so you do have to know the right questions. And on search, it's not just the number of keywords, but yeah, how many times did you touch the account? How many optimizations did you actually make? And then just looking at that snapshot of keywords. It's like, these were the 200 I started with, or these were the 3,500. I'm going to look 3 months later and see
Mhm.
if that looks like the same picture or if it's changed. And if it hasn't changed, then that tells you something about how much attention they're putting on it.
Yeah, and you definitely need to set expectations with that vendor. So if it's like, "Hey, you're crushing my XBI my expectations, my KPIs," then do you want them to possibly screw with the campaign and mess it up? And isn't it worth at least having eyes on, like,
Mhm,
where you're paying their fee? I
mhm,
think this is where flat fee models could come in really well. Could be maybe you should ask your vendor, because let's say that going back to your location base, "Yep, I want to run a campaign." So backing up for a second, if this was traditional advertising and you're gonna put up a billboard and it's like, Bucky's, the gas station in Texas, and Bucky's, like, every mile for 100 miles puts up a billboard. They're like, "I wanna show this message and that message until you get to Bucky's." It's gonna be one cost, and they don't change it based on how many cars drove by on Tuesday.
mhm,
Yet for us in digital, we are changing based on impressions. So that makes it really challenging, as you were saying, fulfillment,
mhm.
to say like, "Ugh, you wanna do this sequential marketing to this one property, but there's only, 400 people that live there. So I can't do that labor and charge you on a CPM. Instead, it could be like, for $1,000, I will set this up. And then don't hold me accountable to how many impressions got served because this is how you wanted the campaign designed. So just one way to think about it creatively if you want to have a more sizzle like campaign that you're going to communicate back to your owner.
Yeah, great example. Yeah, there's definitely tipping points, as you said, depending on kind of the scale, the value, that you move to like a flat fee or you would exit out of, kind of an impression based model. So, yeah, I was trying to think of another good examples. Well, listings and citations. I know that's near and dear to your heart. So, yeah, share a little bit about your thoughts on, is that a commodity? I think we already know the answer to that, but you know, how much have you seen that evolve, or has it beyond that commodity state that it reached? I'll say a decade ago.
Mhm.
So first, if you can just clear up, what is listing management, citations? Is that, and what makes it a commodity? And then, has it evolved, or is it still more or less in the same state that it was 10 years ago?
Yeah, so your listings or citations online would be, like your Yelp listing, Google My Business, Facebook, Apple Maps, that kind of thing. There are really, I don't know, 120 directories that matter, but there are three major networks that matter. Meaning, like Network A will submit to all of these channels and update all those channels. Network B, same thing. So, really, it is a commodity because those aggregators have made it simple to build software that then pushes out to these 125 directories that matter. Now, yes, some citation or listing management people might get an extra 30, publications or something, but does it's arguable if it matters or not. Because it's like you want someone on Uber and Lyft and Google Maps or whatever, right? Apple Maps. So that's what it is. Then that technology, I'd say, is way closer to commodity for sure. It's the servicing on top of. So we've had many clients that used to manage their citations themselves, and then they said, "Wow, making sure hours of operations get accurately updated whenever we change it for a holiday weekend or whatever is really time consuming. We would rather have you do this, and you manage the errors that pop up and the manual corrections and all that needs to happen." So yeah, the basic citations, it is commodity. It's the servicing on top of, like, if your Google profile gets suspended, who's going to be handling the communication with Google to get that reopened? That if you that's where the service on top of matters.
Totally. And display slash programmatic is very similar. I just say that when you mention the networks. So you have, huge networks, AppNexus, Google Ads, Rubicon, blah blah blah. And some of them do the piping plus, have the inventory. Some of them are just, gateway to the inventory. But in either case, it is aggregators. They're pulling all this inventory, and in milliseconds, there's bidding that's happening. Um, from different agencies, different buyers. That's the supply side versus, the demand side. Or I'm sorry, the supply side are those providers, and then the demand side, of course, are the people that are buying it. And then they determine. And sometimes it's a second auction that happens, and you even will see sometimes a third that will ultimately dictate the price that that display inventory is going to go for when it gets to the end buyer, which is pretty crazy. And so you see this, and I'm going to go automotive for a split second here on, is this really a trend of people are going to start buying more direct, their automobiles, and avoid, because of the idea that they're getting the cost savings. Do you see the, kind of potentially similar trend or parallels when it comes to digital advertising as what we're seeing with automotive, where it's like more and more people are going to, I guess, become wise, but I don't want to, misstate or represent that and say, "The hell with that, I'm just gonna go direct." What what might stop this industry, multifamily, from that same trend that, the automotive industry is starting to experience?
Well, just to restate and frame and make sure we're in the same place. So, automotive used to go through an agency to buy their display or programmatic advertising. Now they're saying we could go direct, to
That's true too, but I was actually literally speaking about buying a car.
okay, so it goes straight to Ford versus to the dealership.
Right. I don't wanna deal with the salesman, AKA in our case, digital agency. I'm just gonna go buy that car myself. I'll save myself a couple $1,000s, by doing that, but I don't get the
Yeah.
same experience.
You
So
just I would say in that case, it's actually not true that you save any money to go direct to Ford, but you do get a different service, meaning in your case, no service versus like the salesman blowing you up on the weekends,
and
which
so
sucks.
that's strictly to bypass, like, the
Right.
salesy
Yeah, right. The
the
sliminess
slimy sales guy.
that's associated.
Okay.
But I do think, like, to your point on the going direct, I think as you mentioned, it's you just in your little 30-second description of demand side versus supply side, it's complicated, and I think what you will see is the right kind of providers prevent fraud, and that industry is wrought with fraud because of how complicated it is, and so you could go direct, but you're probably going to be taken advantage of and get hit with a lot of fraudulent impressions or clicks or what have you, and so you're probably better off going with somebody that knows what to. It's almost like you used to joke because we've had some of our employees go down to Mexico to get some surgical work done, and it's like, do you trust
Mhm.
those
Mhm.
surgeons versus the ones we have up here or not? So I'm just giving an example where it's like yes, you can go get it elsewhere. Maybe it will feel like it's less expensive, but is that the experience you want?
Yeah, experience shouldn't be overlooked, I think, when it comes to all this digital advertising and commodities that we're referencing. Um, there's something on the on the direct. The other part of it for this industry that I think will hold that up, that potential, I guess, trend, is the franchise element you referenced earlier with Lincoln.com versus, a property the $2,500 budget. Because most of these larger, like, publishers, digital advertising, like digital inventory, um, you're not going to get a seat at the table unless you meet certain minimum, like, spend levels, and you're not going to get there through one account. And in most cases, because we've tried to do this on behalf of all of our portfolio,
Mhm.
like not just one PMC, they still won't allow it. Where it's like, I'm sorry, we won't look at you in aggregate. It's
Mhm.
too complicated for us. Again, Ogilvy just saying we're
Yeah.
we're not interested. So that's something else that I think could slow down or prevent this trend from picking up too much momentum, where those commodities are now starting to be purchased direct from, property management companies.
Yeah, because they have to consider the support they're going to give you, and so Simplify is a good option, is a good example there. But their minimums last time I talked to them were like 30 grand a month in
Hmm.
spend,
Hmm.
and so one property is not going to get a Simplify login, and it's because they know that they have to onboard you and train you because it's a Ferrari that you're
Hmm.
buying. It's
Hmm.
like, or maybe even more it's a spaceship you're buying, right? So it's like, no, we got to teach you how not to kill yourself. So I I'm with you that it's these minimums are going to prevent, and also because they don't want that type of business. And we've had some of these, I'll say, commodity conduits that come to us directly and say, "Hey, we have clients, we have apartment clients that are looking to buy our stuff. We do not want to work directly with them. Would you please,
Mhm.
use our stuff and we will pass you the leads and you'll become our preferred, vendor or whatever when someone from apartments comes in. And we love those relationships because it allows us to, as you said, bring these special technologies. I say special, but these technologies to our clients at scale because we can standardize the process versus, and they don't, the vendor doesn't really want to go direct to those clients.
Yep, yep. Alright, well, wrapping up, or at least from my side, would you say ChatGPT has turned, generative content, into a commodity already, or do you think it's headed that direction? So everybody's talking about this. This is the game changer. Now you can scale content. It's so easy to plug and play, and the quality's good. All this stuff. Digital commodity, or headed that direction?
It's funny because I was going to ask you about chatbots, and if you thought
Oh yeah,
chatbots were a commodity. So
yeah. That one gives me pause. And partly, I I'm gonna try to avoid naming names here, but my own education about how some of these chatbots in multifamily are approaching things. And I think some of them are approaching in a way that I would say is probably more skews more towards a commodity. And some are doing some things that are more sophisticated. It may take them longer to get there, but I probably wouldn't classify. It's easy to say just chatbots at large, like AI leasing agents, are now a commodity in multifamily. But I think if you understand what's underneath them, you might not come to that conclusion so quickly. So I don't know if you see it the same way, but at a macro level, I might say, yeah, I'm okay calling that. But now that I know a little bit more about what's underneath them, I'm not
yeah,
sure that I would.
maybe it's more of like they're a dime a dozen versus like commodity or not, because I think it reminds me of Penn and Teller when they had their Showtime show. They did an episode on water, and they were like bottled water, and you know they did their test where it's a restaurant and they pretend it's all really fancy bottled water, and of course it's just water coming out of the hose.
Hmm. Hmm.
But they were presenting each one in a different way, the way they were like positioning it to the client, and that each of those
Hmm.
tasters would be
Hmm.
like, "Oh,
Hmm.
I love this one from Everest," and blah blah blah. So I think there's something to it, but it's also like, what is the end result to the client? Like, it's just water. So, like, does it matter, like, if someone had to hike it from Everest, or did it matter if it came out of the sink? Some of that is, in that case, is like how it makes you feel and why you're buying that particular water.
Hmm.
But I would say the same for chatbots here. It's like you could have, let's say, a chatbot like experience. It's all handled by people with PhDs, and they're copywriting experts.
Hmm.
But do you care if it ends up getting the same, like, uh, lead or, tours as the automated, like, chatbot? Probably not. So, the outcome is all that really matters in that case, eventually, unless for some reason you're
Well,
buying
is
that
that part
system.
of what you would say also distinguishes between a commodity and non-commodity? Because back to the Merriam-Webster definition as well as yours, but they say mass-produced, unspecialized product.
Mhm.
And so, if you had 200 forms of orange juice, right, but one was 40% of the market, and also help people, regrow their hair, that's my own dream, then that is definitely not a commodity. Maybe I shouldn't have added that last part. But with chatbots, it's like, yeah, there's a proliferation of AI leasing agents right now and
Mhm.
chatbots in the industry, but there's these two or three that have way more market share. And to your point, what is the outcome? And the outcome is significantly better. Like you are actually seeing 30%, 40% higher conversion rates, tour to lease, et cetera. Would you still say commodity just performs better, or would you say that huge gap in performance is tells me that that's actually not a commodity, that's a specialized product, a specialized version or iteration of a chatbot?
Well, I love the framework recently. You and I haven't talked that much about it, but it's called jobs to be done. It's why are you hiring this thing? So my example I give to the staff is Victor, our head of engineering. When he buys coffee, he buys it simply for the caffeine jolt. In
Mhm.
fact, when he first came in, he bought Folgers instead of using the Nespresso we had because he's like, oh, why?
So
Gives me
disappointing.
a jolt. Versus yourself, you buy coffee certainly for, the energy it gives you, but you are you are also buying it for the taste. And then there are other times that you might be buying it for the experience because you want it like poured over or whatever.
Mhm,
So,
mhm,
what is the job to be done of the coffee you're buying today? And I would say that about any of these commodity products, it's like your job to be done of, in this case, maybe an AI leasing agent is like, I just need to check the box and like move along. This other one may be better, but shoot, man, the maintenance is rough. Or the setup it takes me 4 hours instead of like 15 minutes,
mhm,
and so I'll take the 15-minute step because I just need the box checked.
mhm, mhm,
So the jobs to be done, I think, is really important here. As far as your earlier question about Chat GPT, I think that will enable more commodities to exist. But as long as we vendors and providers keep pushing one another on innovation, like, oh, we brought in this data source, now we brought in that data source. As long as the vendors aren't allowed to get complacent, then it will prevent the commodities from happening. It'll
mhm.
just, you know, ChatGPT would enable more commodities, but as long as like Digible tries to forge ahead with NLG, it's going to force everybody else to continue to innovate too, and it won't allow it to be a commodity.
Well said. Love the way you navigated that.
Well, I think it's true, and hopefully that's um, well, I think this industry is experiencing more of that. I think the industry was really sleepy for a while, and now it feels like there's so much investment coming into prop tech that this industry is not going to be allowed to get back to being sleepy again. And I
Mhm,
think there's going to be continue to be a lot of innovation. The challenge will be for the discerning marketer. How will the marketer really know fact from fiction?
mhm,
Because it's back years ago at the first Digital Summit, it was like, what is AI versus machine learning?
mhm.
With Professor Beaver, and I think there's a lot of that that's about to hit the industry with NLG in particular.
Yep. You definitely need to know the right questions to ask, but what are you prepared to do based on those answers? Because this gets to our last cast, I think, was on insourcing, outsourcing. So just be thoughtful, careful, all for, innovating and testing, but don't rush to any decisions based on what you discover in that process of peeling back the onion on digital advertising and, the commodities that are rampant.
Hmm. Cool. All right. Well, hope you guys enjoyed. Um, I guess we'll be back next week.
We will.